This network of 25,000 miles of pipeline that is planned to be built out and installed in the United States by 2050 is on top of an existing network of pipelines. That build out for CO2 pipelines is completely unrealistic. The scientists touting this as a solution expect us to build more infrastructure to move CO2 than we've built to move oil and gas in the last 100 years, and they expect that to be built out in the next 20 years. Existing natural gas pipelines on top of that can't easily just be converted. They can't be converted into CO2 pipelines, and Nikki's going to go into that in a bit more detail in just a minute, because CO2 has to be moved at extremely high temperature and extremely low temperature and extremely high pressure, which means the pipelines need to be thicker and they need to be able to withstand much more pressure and that extreme temperature differential than natural gas pipelines. So what we're talking about is not just a couple of new pipelines. We're talking about a massive new network of pipelines on top of an existing massive network of pipelines, just to be able to move CO2 theoretically on the public dime. And with that, I'm now going to pass the mic to Nikki, and I will continue sharing my screen, and she will take over the next few slides. So Nikki.
Great, thank you very much, and I hope you all can hear me well. My name is Nikki Reisch, and I work with Jane at the Center for International Environmental Law. So as Jane was just saying, CO2 pipelines are not fossil fuel pipelines. They're not natural gas or oil pipelines. The qualities and characteristics of CO2 and the conditions under which it has to be transported pose unique risks. And these are risks that the current federal and most state regulatory frameworks do not yet address comprehensively. Even the White House's Council on Environmental Quality made these same observations about the fact that there are gaps in the existing regulatory framework at the federal level that need to be addressed. And there are certainly few states that have yet to adapt their existing state laws and regulations to accommodate the unique risks. And what is it about CO2 that poses these unique risks? I mean, three of those factors highlighted here are that it is transported in a supercritical state, as has been said, which requires extremely high pressure. That high pressure requires thicker pipelines and different pipeline characteristics than those that are used for gas and oil, which is why it's not possible to simply convert existing pipeline networks or to assume that the criteria related to the siting of those existing pipelines would be adequate to address the risks posed by CO2 pipelines. And also crucially, and as we'll hear about more later, CO2 is an asphyxiant and can be fatal at high concentrations. So because there are so few successful CCS projects and so few CO2 pipelines currently operational, the regulatory frameworks are for protecting public health and safety and managing the substance are inadequate, and there are a lack of studies to date. And one WHO expert, in fact, said that the exposure studies simply don't exist. And even industry representatives recognize that given the relatively low number of pipelines, failure data is very limited. And so the cumulative experience to date has really impaired the evolution of the regulatory framework. Next slide, please. So liquid and compressed CO2 is a hazardous substance, and we really can't stress enough, particularly at the volumes and pressures under discussion in the proposed CO2 pipeline projects here. It should be regulated as such, consistent with the classification by the Department of Transportation, PHMSA, which lists and classifies the gaseous, liquid, and solid forms of carbon dioxide as hazardous. And unlike oil and gas, the risk with transportation of CO2 at critical and supercritical pressures is not ignition, but asphyxiation. And you'll hear more about this, among other impacts, from Dr. Steingraber and also from Dan Ziegert, who will discuss one of the known instances of a rupture. The spread of CO2 released from a pipeline can be really quite extensive because of the diameter of these pipelines and the immense pressure, as we saw in that even controlled release video above, and recognizing that that was in controlled conditions outside of occupied or used lands. Next slide, please. So what adds to the risk posed by CO2 ruptures or running fractures are that CO2 is a colorless, odorless gas that is denser than air. And so when there is a rupture and it is released, it accumulates in low-lying areas and doesn't dissipate quickly, posing a threat to people, wildlife, including first responders who may come to the area. And it makes the topography a really important consideration in siting CO2 pipelines, because one needs to understand those dynamics of how a rupture or leak could play out. And when these pipelines are sited in rural areas, it adds, these features of CO2 add to the complexity of emergency response. And I'll talk about that more in just a moment. But when CO2 is released at high concentrations, it not only can have health impacts, but it can actually prevent internal combustion engines from working, which makes evacuation very challenging, and it can make it hard for assistance and emergency help to reach the areas in some cases. Next slide, please. Sorry, I just wanted to, before we transfer on, I just wanted to, flag something that is often raised, is that CO2 is compared to, well, it's a harmless substance. We have it in our fizzy water and our carbonated drinks. But just to really underscore the point that's been made here, when we're talking about a massive pipeline network and system of this scale and volume and pressure, it is a completely different substance that poses a range of hazards. So turning to other dimensions of the CCS build out that could pose, or proposed CCS build out, I should say, that complicate and compound the risks of rupture and the health impacts, are the potential presence of impurities in the pipeline. So CO2 might not be the only thing in a pipeline, and the presence of impurities such as hydrogen sulfide and sulfur dioxide are particularly issues when the CO2 stream is sourced from power and industrial plants, but there simply aren't enough studies to know whether the presence of those impurities is also an issue at fertilizer plants, certainly, and at ethanol processing plants as well. It certainly could be. And water, in fact, the presence of water is one of the chief causes of corrosion in pipelines. And as the federal government, has recognized in the CUQ's report, federal pipeline safety regulations don't include standards for CO2 composition or purity. So this is a big gap in the existing regulatory framework, and there just isn't information about those impurities to answer the question. So this is a key issue for regulators thinking through, are these concerns being sufficiently addressed under existing regulations, and what guarantees are provided by proponents of these projects. Next slide, please. So what role for state regulators with respect to these risks and concerns? There are a number of different ways in which states are called upon to act to protect public health, to protect the environment, and to ensure the enforcement and oversight of safety. So while pipeline safety is regulated under DOT, Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration authority that has set out different regulations for interstate CO2 pipelines, there is a clear role for the state government, not only in overseeing pipeline siting, including zoning issues, setbacks, and the environmental impacts of pipeline, both impacts on surface and subsurface waters in terms of their location and the potential effects of risk, but also in terms of the pipeline permitting processes, the involvement of local government authorities and public participation, and crucially, determining for what purposes a CO2 pipeline developer may use eminent domain, if at all, to secure land and rights of way for CO2 pipelines. With respect to pipeline safety, as I said, enforcement of the minimum safety standards by DOT that DOT has set may fall on state authorities, and states like Minnesota can enact more stringent standards pursuant to certification if they have that certification from DOT, which I believe Minnesota has for natural gas pipelines. Two other crucial areas of regulation to have on the radar and to really think through the adequacy of existing regulations are, as I mentioned, with respect to first responder preparedness, both the resources and funds to respond and the training necessary to do so, which does not exist in most locations, and also modes for participation by local governments and the public. And we'll note here that an issue that arises many times is the adequacy of disclosures about plans regarding projects and their locations and risks with affected communities. And critically in Minnesota, where there are populations of Native Americans and indigenous populations, they need to be at the table and crucially consulted on discussions about CCS pipeline siting, and as we know has been an issue in many pipeline debates. So just to be clear that the federal government does not have authority over the siting of interstate CO2 pipelines across federal and non-federal lands. So states really are in the driver's seat in terms of establishing regulatory frameworks within their state boundaries, which include responsibility, as I said, for siting and permitting those pipelines, as well as segments of interstate hazardous pipelines that are within those boundaries. Next slide, please. And we're getting towards we're getting towards the end here. So one of the crucial questions that regulations need to consider in establishing appropriate setback distances from occupied areas and in buffer zones. And the criteria used for oil and gas pipelines cannot simply be transposed for the reasons we discussed above without tailored analysis. As I think will become clear from the example that from the safety video we saw at the beginning, and as from the example of the leak in Mississippi, ductile running fractures are a primary concern. And so engineering specifications and safety standards are critical to ensure that the pipelines being used meet the appropriate tests and have the appropriate ability to withstand the high pressures and enough checkpoints to respond with safety valves. Preventing public safety is really a critical issue, and this is going to grow in importance as the plans for build out affect more and more populous areas. So we're no longer talking about pipelines merely in oil and gas exploitation zones. We're talking about pipelines that run in through areas with small towns and even close to big cities. Next slide, please. If the CO2 moving, I think we'll go ahead to the next slide, please. Sorry. Because the current, it might be the case that current CCS proposals are only involving pipelines running through Minnesota, it's important that regulators consider other aspects of the CCS process beyond transportation, because with the pressure to build out carbon capture and storage across the country, those other dimensions of the carbon capture and storage process may well affect the state. And that includes upstream issues around the capture process, as well as downstream issues around injection and storage. And as June addressed a bit ago, the solvents used in the chemical capture process need to be regulated, both their use, transportation, and disposal. And the CEQ, again, the Council on Environmental Quality has mentioned that there has been insufficient study and regulation with regard to the effects of the use of those chemicals on air pollutants and air quality in the vicinity of industrial facilities equipped with capture. So that is another dimension that remains understudied and underregulated at the federal level existing, and also is important for areas in non-attainment. With regard to injection and storage, the downstream use of the carbon that may be transported through these pipelines, there's a lot of risk with respect to the siting of pipelines, the injection of pipeline contents in proximity to oil and gas wells or depleted wells. There are lots of risks that doing so, as has been discussed for the destination of pipelines coming from Minnesota into North Dakota, even if the proponents disclaim enhanced oil recovery as an objective, there is concern that injecting CO2 in areas of depleted oil and gas could raise issues of affecting the pressure, contamination, and leakage, and even generating concerns about produced water, which can be radioactive and can require other hazardous management. There's a whole other slew of issues that are not currently adequately regulated with regard to ensuring the permanence of storage. There's a lot of promises made that the CO2 injected would be stored for millions of years, but the studies just aren't there to prove that that is possible. And there are a lot of concerns about the adequacy of monitoring and oversight, particularly when we've seen some states adopt regulations that transfer ownership and with it disclaim liability for oversight and monitoring of injection sites after as little as 10 years in some cases. So we wanted to just bring some of these issues to your attention as you're thinking through the risks posed by these proposals and the adequacy of existing regulations at the state and federal level to really prevent environmental and health disasters. I'll turn it back to you, Jane.
Thanks, Nikki. And we just wanted to close out this presentation by pointing out we understand that there have been reassurances given to the people of Minnesota that the carbon that is passing through the state will not be used for enhanced oil recovery. But we just want to reiterate that the over 80% of the CO2 that is captured in the United States is used for enhanced oil recovery. And globally, that number is other studies suggest that it's actually over 90% of CO2 collected globally is used for enhanced oil recovery. And the climate justifications for capturing CO2 as any kind of a climate solution depend on the reality of sequestration, permanent sequestration. If there is any possibility that it might leak out at any point in the future, that obviously releases the CO2 into the atmosphere, which is exactly what this technology is meant to avoid. And frankly, any justification for CCS evaporates completely if that CO2 is used for enhanced oil recovery. And if the pipelines moving through Minnesota or other states are funded through state or federal climate subsidies, as is often the case, and we understand is the case with some projects coming up in Minnesota, the use of that CO2 for enhanced oil recovery could actually jeopardize those subsidies. And if the eventual injection sites for the CO2 that is moving through Minnesota pipelines are very near existing oil and gas wells, we certainly recommend that regulators should be fully investigating what the CO2 will be used for, whether it will actually be permanently sequestered, and what guarantees there are that those storage sites are safe and permanent as has been claimed.